Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Chelin Red Honey Processed Mexico from Red Bank Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Red Bank, based out of Kendal, United Kingdom, and this coffee right here was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video as part of the Right Roasts February subscription box, where it finished first place out of 4 coffees on that day. And going into that video, we'd previously reviewed one of Red Bank's coffees, which was an experimentational processed Colombia. And if I didn't say towards the end of that review that I wanted to review something a little bit more standard from them, then I most certainly should have, as I'm not entirely sure how standard this coffee is, given that it is a honey processed Mexican geisha, which is unique in its own right. But it was the coffee that definitely caught my interest the most when purchasing this taster set. So it'll be an interesting review. This right here is day 27 of this coffee. And once again, these are taster bags, so they're smaller samples, 50-gram bags, and as a result, they're shorter reviews, and the Right Roast has a recipe for all of these coffees, and the recipe they had for this one was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, and I like this coffee better through the V60, so a more medium fine grind. For this cup of coffee, roast profile is interesting. So for our first review, we said lighter, but that's always difficult to tell with those more experimentational coffees. This one's by far the most developed of those 4 coffees that we had, so I think most people would most closely align this with a more European medium for the roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 18, which was that blind taste test day, and it was the sweetest cup of coffee on that table. We were definitely able to pull out so much fruit sweetness and brightness that was coming from the cup of coffee, most distinctly a pretty strong out there melon flavor to it. And as a result, it left a really positive first impression, but I don't think I've ever mentioned this before. Usually after those videos, I'll go ahead and drink the cups of coffee afterwards to kind of write some notes, get an overall impression of them after that blind taste test. And what I noted from this coffee was that it definitely came out a little bit more smoky than I think I was expecting. And that was a lot of after it had cooled down, so I was beginning to wonder, this probably is the most developed cup of coffee that we have here. I picked up on it throughout the video, but it was definitely more pronounced by the end of that video. So we were going to continue to see, and on day 22, yeah, it was interesting. I don't like this coffee through the Chemex, so it felt significantly more hollow through the Chemex on day 22, and here on day 27, it doesn't necessarily feel as maybe lively as it did through the V60. The strong ripe melon is actually a secondary characteristic to this kind of tame vanilla-like sweetness that's present in the cup, but that's all secondary to what feels like a pretty robust smokiness that's coming from the cup of coffee, and as mentioned, I feel like that just kind of is an attribute to maybe slightly more developed cups of coffee. So that's what I was experiencing the most, and as a result, didn't particularly like it through the Chemex. Running it back through the V60, I was wondering if maybe it was just a brew method sort of thing, but once again, I was somewhat less than impressed with the cup, as off brew, the cup has a very lasting, more developed smokiness to it. The more it cools down, the more the coffee opens up, and there's a fair bit of complexity to it, but it was more in line with this kind of floral vanilla cookie that I would describe it on this day, with the initial with the initial berry fruits being very much a tertiary characteristic at this point, as the smokiness was dominating the cup for me the most throughout whichever brew method I was going with. I think I just liked the maybe focus a little bit more with the V60, as here we are with the Chemex again, and it just feels, again, pretty smoky. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. I think this will be demonstrated very strongly here in this tasting wheel, as we have 2 level 4s, and those 2 level 4s are the finish and the smokiness, because it's a very smoky lasting finish. And here I am experiencing, once again on this day, there is some nice, and it still feels like a cookie sweetness to me, and that's what I'll keep harping on, is like a vanilla cookie, and they have the vanilla flavor note listed on here. That makes a lot of sense, and definitely present in this cup of coffee. That's why the sweetness isn't sacrificed too much. It's still level 3. I think it deserves to be at that level 3. But a couple of other things are sacrificed. It's, not the cleanest cup of coffee, and it's a little lower on the body, being at a level 2, which is likely attributed to the fact that it is a geisha. And then the florals at a level 3. This tasting wheel just kind of looks a little all over the place, as we have a bunch of level 3s as well. I mean, the chocolate's there, which oftentimes it's just easier to lump this vanilla characteristic in with the chocolate, as I don't think it's necessarily the most chocolate cup of coffee. Berry fruit at the level 3, it's by far the most pronounced fruit characteristic in it, but I'm also getting a slight bit of citrus fruits, so as relative as this tasting wheel is, I mean, there are times where something's going to be bumped up a lot higher in this tasting wheel as opposed to it might be to other coffees, but yeah, bitter, it's a little bitter too, so we have that kind of high at the level 3, and acidity, lower side. I mean, it's really hard to describe this tasting wheel given that it's kind of all over the place. while the coffee feels a little bit more focused, it's just not a tasting wheel that I'm used to kind of charting and describing as much as I do with other coffees. And I'll kind of lead into that with my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've always said that I don't necessarily think more developed coffee is any worse than lighter coffees, but I think it's just a little bit more difficult for me to enjoy the more developed cups of coffee than I do the lighter cups of coffee, and that was the case with this one. It left such a wonderful first impression that I feel like if I could have ever replicated that coffee from that point on, then this probably still would have remained my favorite cup of coffee. That first impression I had was such a wonderful first impression, but I think that makes things even more difficult, that you're not able to replicate a cup of coffee that you enjoyed the most, and as a result, you just kind of like it a lot less than you had initially expected or planned to. Not my favorite. I mean, I'll just be honest about that, and I think most of that can be attributed to the fact that it just felt a little too smoky for me specifically. And the type of person I would suggest this coffee to is, I feel like, I mean, it's very English. I've said before that English coffees tend to be significantly more developed than a lot of the European coffees, so even then it does have some really nice cookie sweetness to it, and if you really like the smokiness, I mean, I don't mind the smokiness as long as you're able to balance it out with a lot of the other traits, but I don't think enough of the other traits made up for me specifically. But yeah, if you don't mind the smokiness and it's still a relatively sweet cup of coffee in general and low on the acidity, then this would be a pretty nice fit for you. But for the most part, I think this is kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Red Bank, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Finca Chelin Red Honey Processed Mexico from Red Bank Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.